Aloha and welcome to this WOD called Model Implementation 1 Digits. It's kind of a complicated WOD where we're going to start learning how to add a back-end persistency mechanism to our Play applications. And before doing this WOD, it's really important that you finish A25 Play Example MySQL, that you've installed that application locally, installed MySQL locally, got it to run, so that you've established the database environment variables and so forth. This is going to make your life easier than in doing this WOD than if you hadn't done that before. It's really quite essential. So make sure that you've worked through that assignment first. Okay, so we're going to be for this WOD, what we're basically going to be doing is taking our digits application, which should look something like this. And you log in and you give an administrator email, and then when you come in, you add new contacts and so forth. I don't have the delete method here. If you have the delete, that's good. You should implement that as well. It's a pretty trivial change. But you want to start at least with the digits that has the ability to define a user like an administrator, so that you get a little better exercise with development of entities and relationships. Okay, so let's start the timer, see how this goes. We're going to start by creating a branch MySQL1. I've got my digits, the master version, which is what you just saw. It's running down here. And so what I'll do is I'll create a new branch called MySQL1. And once that's done, we go over here, we can see that we're running in that branch, and then we're supposed to make a small little change to mark the beginning of this WOD. So we'll say starting WOD MySQL1. Okay, so having done that, the first thing that we're supposed to do for this WOD is to create an entity relationship diagram showing the entities, relationships, and fields to be implemented. Okay, so to do that, we'll go to Google Drive, we'll do Create, Lucidchart Diagram, and I think this is supposed to, well, I didn't say what it's supposed to be called, but we'll call it digits. It's kind of a reasonable idea for that. And then let's get rid of the stuff that we don't use, and then let's add the shapes that we do use. Okay, and so let's make an entity. And so what are the entities that we're going to use? I think it's useful to kind of think about this. And it turns out that there's basically two. There's one that's a contact and one that's a user info. So we'll make a contact field. And if we actually look at, kind of expand the contact, we'll see that there's a first name, there's an ID field, there's a first name, there's a last name, and then it looks like we need another field, two more fields. Then there's a telephone and a telephone type. So that's what our contact entity is going to look like. And then we also have this user info. And user info has, let's make one of these. We'll put it like this. User info. And a user info has it's also going to have an ID. It's also going to, and it's going to have an email, name, and a password. Okay. Now the important thing that we have to think about at this point is what's the relationship between user infos and contacts. And I think the relationship is that a a user info instance can be connected to 0 or more contacts, right? We could have a user and have no contacts associated with them yet. So that means that we want to, if we click on this, we want to update this to be 0 to many. And a contact should be related to exactly one user info. We'll do 1 to 1. Okay. So that's pretty simple. So in our system that we have right now, we're basically going to have two kinds of entities: a contact entity and a user info entity, and we're going to have this relationship between them. Okay. So I think that's all we need to do for the entity relationship diagram. Okay, so the next step is to enhance project files for MySQL. And so the way that I think it's easiest to do this is if we go to the play example MySQL, which we know has things set up correctly, and we look at their build SDT, and then we compare that to the build SDT for digits, we can see some differences. Okay, principal difference, the only difference, is that it includes this MySQL connector. Okay, that's got to be loaded so we can connect to MySQL. Everything else looks pretty much the same, so we can save that out. Okay, then let's go and look at application.conf. Let's start off by looking at application.conf in so this is the application.conf for digits up here, and then this is the application.conf for MySQL. And what we're going to find is that in the database section, okay, we are going to want to have this stuff defined. Okay, so let's just replace that with this. And then in the evolution section, we're going to want to have apply evolutions set to true. Let's do that. And then in the ebeam section, we've got to tell it that we're using the ebeam ORM. And that's about it. Okay, so that's the application.conf. So that should work fine now. Let's save that out. Okay, and then the next thing we want to do is fix the digit system to use -1 as the new context sentinel value. This is a little frustrating that I did not actually tell you guys to use -1. When we initially developed this, I just kind of spaced out about this particular issue that was going to show up. But it turns out that 0 is a valid ID value in MySQL databases, so we don't want to use 0 as our indicator, otherwise we're going to have problems. So I'm just going to, because that was kind of my bad, I'm going to make it easy for you by just telling you the files to look at. And so if you look in this file, you'll see that ID should be the application.conf. You do a check for that, and I don't think you have to check for any place else. And then in contact DB, we have this check to see whether or not it's -1. I think that's the only place we do that check. And then in contact form data, which is in our form data package, what we're going to do is we're going to actually say that this should be -1 by default, and then check to see if there's any other spots where this goes. I don't see any, so we should be fine there. And in the routes file, when the routes, you can see that this is a place where if we don't pass anything to the new contact, we're going to give it a default value of 0, so we're going to change that to be -1. Okay, so that finishes fixing the digits system. That's how I teach this. And from now on, I'm always going to use -1 as my second value, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so that's kind of all the preliminary stuff. Now what we're going to do is actually get into annotation of the entity classes, which is where kind of the fun begins. Okay, so we're going to start with our models package. And actually, you know, I'm going to show you a little trick here, one that I used, which is that I basically took these 3 import statements from page retrieval, and then I just like full on copied them into this to make sure that I could have the right set of classes for doing this. So I'm going to say contact extends model, extends model, and then I'm going to annotate my ID with @ID. Okay. Oh, and then I have to annotate my class with @entity. All right. And then if we look at this warning, what we're going to see is that we need a serial version UID. So we can just have Eclipse add one of those for us, because it turns out that model is a serializable class. And then the next thing that we want to do is add our relationship. Okay? Notice we don't have any relationships in here because the relationship is basically was implicitly managed in our contact DB through that map that we created for this stuff. But now we've got to actually do it in the database. So what we're going to do is we're going to create for each contact we have one we're going to have one user info, right? Each contact has a one-to-one relationship with user info instances, and now we've got to annotate that, and we want to say this is many to one, okay? And the reason why we want to say many to one, because and then we also need actually a many to one relationship, so we just use the quick fix to get that there. Now, why is it many to one? And I like to use this little kind of heuristic of thinking about what this says. This says many of me maps to one of the following. So many of me, in other words, many of the contacts maps to one single user info instance. So one of the following is the field on the following line. So it's, many of me contacts maps to one of the following, i.e. user info. Okay, and then if we go here, we see that many of these contacts, well actually 0 to many of these contacts, maps to one of the user info. Okay? So that's that, and then the other thing we want to do is we want to create some getters and setters. So we can say encapsulate field, get user info, set user info, and these should be public. Okay, and this just kind of guarantees that they have the right name, because if they don't have the right name, then then the e-beam guy is going to be extremely unhappy. Okay, so that, I think, basically, there's one other thing we have to do here. We go back to here. So we've added the @entity, we've extended model, added the serial version UID, added the @ID, added at least one side of our bidirectional relationship annotation. We also need to add a find method. Okay, so if we go back to page retrieval, what we can see is there is this kind of boilerplate definition that we want to use, that we want to provide in all our entities to kind of interface to the e-bean query language. Okay, and the way you do this is you just basically copy this form, okay, and then make it a little better, find a method for contacts. Okay, so now we've got going to have this find method defined, which is going to allow us to build, as you'll see later, some ways to query, to get objects in and out of the MySQL database using Java syntax and not using kind of MySQL syntax. Okay, and then we actually don't need that import because this find method, this finder method, is actually part of a not a subclass, an internal class of the model class. Okay? All right, so there's our model entity. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for our user info entity. Okay, so actually what we'll do is we'll go back to, get rid of page retrieval. We'll go back to contact and we will do our same little trick here of doing the imports that we need, and then adding at entity, user info extends model, and then we need a private long ID, and we're going to annotate it with @ID, and then we're going to need that serial version UID. So we'll create one of those. Not doing too good on the Java comments on this one. And probably need some getters and setters for this ID. So we'll do encapsulate field, get ID, set ID, make them public. Looks good. Okay, so now we've got that. And the only other thing I think we need for this user info guy is our relationship. And so remember that a user info guy can have many contacts associated with him. All right, so the way we're going to implement that is to say private list of contacts equals new array list. Okay, so there's our declaration, and then we're going to probably have some imports that we need to. So we're going to import Java list, and then we got to import array list. Okay, and so this is one of me maps to many of the following. So we're going to say at one to many. And then in this case, one to many's, we have to have in bidirectional relationships, we have to add in the field in the other entity that's going to actually store this relationship, and that's user info. Okay, so user info is the field that's going to do this, and then unfortunately we haven't imported that. Okay, so we'll add that. Okay, and then we're basically going to need to be able to get at those contacts. Okay, so we're going to have we're going to have a public list contact. Get contacts, return this.contacts. And then we also might want to have a public void add contact, contact, where we say this.contacts.add contact. And we'll see, that is potentially all we'll need for this entity. We'll kind of find out as we move along. Oh, also we need the finder. Right, we know we need the finder, so let's go find our, here's our finder. So we'll take the code from contact, copy it, and then we just want to, we want to actually, it's doing the imports for us, but what we really want this to be as a finder for user info, not for contact. So let's fix that. Okay, and then we'll probably get this spurious. Okay, so there we have our entity. Pretty much everything I think we need. We've extended model. We've added the at entity. We've added the serial version UID. We've added an at ID. We've added a bidirectional relationship in it. So now we've got both of them pointing the way we want to. And contact, just to make sure, we did have a getter and setter for user info. I do believe that's true. Get set user info and get user info. Okay. And we got the find methods. Okay, so we look pretty good with our entities. Okay, now we're going to switch to our database classes. Okay, and this is where things also get pretty interesting. We'll start with the, with the contact DB. And the idea here is that the good news is that we previously, when we developed this Digits application, we created these two classes, contact DB and user info DB, which encapsulated all of the quote-unquote database or repository related operations. So really, all we have to do is work on these two classes and make them, instead of using these in-memory data structures, in the case of contact DB, this mapping, we're going to actually have it go out to the database. So that's kind of the nice, and you might even find this to be a useful design pattern for use in other applications that you build. It's just basically in your models class, create these little DB classes which manage the persistency of these instances, and then you don't have to fiddle around all your application and everything else. In your controllers, you just call out to these classes to do whatever you need them to do. Okay. So the way I want to start with this is by getting rid of the local state. Okay. So in general, one of the things about using a backend database is we really don't want to have any local state. If we can, well, we just can't have any local state. Okay, because each time we process a request, the only place we could store a local state would be on the session object, and session objects shouldn't, really have complicated things in them. So what we're going to, so basically what we have to do is just get rid of this. And the benefits of this actually is that this application wouldn't have worked very well with multiple users using this kind of in-memory repository, and it certainly wouldn't have worked well if the system had gone down, because then of course you lose all the data. So we'll start off by just getting rid of that local state, and then kind of figuring out where where we're at. Okay, so we have to update the repo with a new contact if ID equals 0, and actually we want to make that -1, because that's the way it is right now. We've already made that fix. Okay, so the first thing is that we no longer are actually managing our ID values. Okay, so that's this code isn't needed at all anymore. But one thing we do need from this code is we need to be able to figure out whether or not this request to add a contact is a request to either add a new contact, create a brand new contact, or simply update a contact that we already have. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say Boolean is new contact is going to be equal to this value right here. And that's the important kind of information. We don't really want to figure out what our IDs are. And then the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, when we create contacts, we're no longer going to pass IDs. That's not any longer a relevant piece of information for the system to be maintaining. So we're going to go back to our contact entity, and we're going to find our constructor. And we're going to say, this is not part of the situation. Okay. All right. And then, we've basically got two cases here. We've got this situation where we've got if we have a new contact, then we want to add that contact to the database. And if it's not a new contact, we just want to retrieve it and update the fields, because the fields have presumably changed because they're edited. So let's just take care of those in this way. We can say if is new contact, okay, then, okay, we're going to create our new contact instance. And then we have to find the user info that's instance from the database that's associated with this user. And so the way we can do that is by this. We can say user info is going to be equal to userinfo.find, okay? And then we're going to use this expression syntax that the finder method in the eBean ORM provides. And so, over time, you're going to have to start kind of looking at that, kind of getting used to using this syntax, which is basically this kind of Java. It replaces the SQL select, insert, all that kind of stuff, and provides this kind of more Java-esque version of it. And that has, it has pros and cons to it, which we can, talk about at length. You'll kind of discover. But for the most part, I think for simple queries, this is a much easier way to do it rather than try to use the kind of the raw SQL. Although it requires, getting used to this syntax. Okay, so what this basically ends up saying is we're going to use the find method that we've defined for the user info class, which is a way of querying the user info table. Okay, so we're querying the user info table containing all our user info entities, and then we're going to try to retrieve a user info entity object where the email field is equal to this user that we passed in. And then we're going to say we want to find the single value in the table that is equivalent to those conditions, and return null if that person's not found. Okay. So what I'm going to do here, just as a sanity check, Okay. As a sanity check, I'm going to say if user info equals null. So if we didn't find the user, that should never happen, right? So we're going to say throw new runtime exception could not find user plus user. Okay, that's just to make sure we fail immediately if we were not able to retrieve the user from the database. Okay. Now so now we've got this new contact entity object that we've just created. It's got the right fields. We've got this user info entity object that we found from the database, and we're pass this if, so we know these two things exist. Now what we want to do is we want to connect them together by setting their fields. So for user info, we want to add contact. Okay, so that sets that side of the relationship. Okay, and then we want to say contact dot set user info, and then we put user info in there. Okay, so you can see that so this also kind of relates to our one-to-many relationship. We have a set indicating that this is just, a contact can have only one user info, whereas with user info we have an add indicating that a user info object can have many contacts associated with it. So now we've got our links pointing both ways. And the last thing that we need to do is call contact.save and userinfo.save, which is the ebean. Actually, it turns out that when we extended this entity, this class contact with model, we got some operations. And one of the operations that we got is the ability to call save. Okay, so now we've persisted these two objects out to the database. Okay, so that's what happens if we determine that this contact that we've added is a new contact. So let's ask ourselves what we should do in the event that it's not a new contact, but the contact already exists. Okay, so in this case, our ID actually represents the actual ID of the contact object in the database. So let's go out there and try to get that thing. And so the way we do that is we say contact equals contact.find. So this is our finder method for instances of contact. And in this case, there's a by ID method, which enables us to simply go out and get that thing. Okay? And then having got it, we can say contact.setFirstName is equal to formData.firstName. We can say contact. We're just going to, we don't know which of these fields actually were the ones that were changed, so we just got to do them all. Form contact.set telephone is going to be form data.telephone. Oops. And then contact.set telephone type. Contact.set telephone type is going to be form data.telephone type. Okay, so we've set all the fields that we care about, and then we can call contact.save. Okay, so just a parenthetical comment, you'll find there is an update method, so you know that in that kind of save and update are slightly different. It turns out that when we actually retrieve a contact from the database, okay, ebean is smart enough, we can always call save, and it will either do an update or a save depending upon whether it's a new or existing instance. So, basically the heuristic is you can always use save. Okay, the only time you can't use save is when you construct a contact from scratch and then kind of set the ID because somehow you knew what the ID was, and then you try to save on that for that, or you try to update on that. Then it's not going to work. But in this case, basically, we're retrieving this from the database. We're updating fields. You'd think we'd have to do update. Update would be perfectly legal, but since we've actually used the ebean ORM to get it, it's aware that this object is something that needs to be actually updated and not kind of created. So it'll all work fine. Okay. Okay. So that's the add contact. Let's save this out, and then let's look and see. Okay. So we have this stuff here, and actually it returns contact in the old version, but that really doesn't make any sense to me. So let's change this to void. Okay, and now we go to get contacts. Okay, and so for get contacts, what we want to do is we want to find all of the contacts that were associated with this user. Okay, so we're going to get rid of this stuff, and the way we're going to implement that is we're going to say user info. First thing we need to do is get the actual user info object associated with that user. And so we'll do that by saying userinfo.find. Again, we're going to go to our database, and then it's just like before. We're going to say where eq email is the same as user, and then we're going to say find unique. Okay, and then if user info equals null. Okay, so in this case, that our specification is that we're supposed to return null if the user is not defined. So okay, we can do that. Return null. And then otherwise, what we want to do is else return userinfo.getContacts. Okay, it's pretty much as easy as that, because when we retrieve this user object from the database, we're also going to get the list of contacts associated with that user. Okay. All right, so that's the get contacts. Now we have this is user. Okay. So how do we do that in database? Well, we know actually we're supposed to return true if the user is defined, and we know already that this particular expression here is going to return either the user or null if the user is not defined. So it's basically a simple matter of just saying we're going to return the result of testing to see whether or not this thing returns null. If it doesn't return null, then in fact we found a user, so that works. And if it does return null, then this will be false, and we should be fine. Okay, so now we're going to get a specific contact object given a particular user. Okay, and so the way we can do this is we've got the ID we've already got the ID associated with the contact instance. So we can basically just say contact equals contact dot find by ID. Okay? And we're supposed to throw a runtime exception if the ID is not found. So then we say if contact equals null, throw new runtime exception, contact ID not found, and we'll say ID. Okay, and then essentially we found this contact. So the question is, well, who's the user? So we can now say user info equals contact dot get user info. All right, so there's the user info associated with this particular contact. And so we can do something like the following. We can say if the user does not equal user info dot get email, Okay, so then we've got a problem. So we can say throw new runtime exception. User not, right. User not the same one stored with contact. Okay. And then, if we get through this without throwing any runtime exceptions, then we've got our contact, and we can just store it. Okay, and it looks like we've got maybe a few spurious import statements at this point. Okay, so there's our contact DB. And now let's go to the user info DB. Okay, and user info DB is actually quite an interesting one because we're storing this. We've got our map of user infos. Okay, but we also have this admin defined, which is kind of this global variable indicating whether or not we have an admin user. Okay, and that's, we could, I guess, set up a table or something that has a single value in it or something. But I think the easiest way to do this is to actually incorporate the notion of whether or not a user is an admin into the user info entity. So let's start by updating our user info entity and say that we have a private Boolean admin. And then for this guy, we want to encapsulate field, and we'll have an isAdmin and a setAdmin, and we'll make them public. Okay, and again, this is really nice because it's recognizing this Boolean, and these are correct Java Bean method names for this. Okay, so now we've got our admin guy. We've got an admin field associated with the user info object. And so we're going to get rid of, and actually what we should do, I think, is say by default, we'll say, by default a user info isn't an admin, so we always know what that, we only have to set him to be true in the case that it turns out to actually to be one. Okay, so now as before, we're going to get rid of our local state, and now we've got to go ahead and figure out how to do this using the database. Okay, so it provides a MySQL, provides access to a MySQL. Okay, and storing credentials in the clear is still kind of bogus. Okay. So how do we do a define admin? Okay. And what I would say here is that we want to check to see if email is not equal to null, password not, that's all also important. But because we now have persistency, we also have to check whether or not our admin is already defined or not. Okay, and so we have to because what we're going to do is we're going to actually define this user in the following line. So we have to say and not admin defined. Okay, and if that's true, then we're going to add a well, in this case, let's just go ahead and build this admin user. So we'll say user info. Oops. I'm going to say user info. What is this? User. user info equals new user info name email password. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so we create one of these user info instances, and then what we also have to do is say, in this particular case, we want this this user info instance to be an admin user info instance. Okay, and then we're going to save it out. All right, so that's our first step here. We define an admin. In order to define an admin, we have to have a non-null email. We have to have a null password, and then we have to have a name. Right. And then we basically just make sure that this, and we have to make sure that we haven't already defined one. Okay, we don't want to define an admin more than once. So we set the admin to be true, and then we save it out. Okay, so now we check, how do we determine whether or not an admin has actually been defined? Okay, and the way we can do that is we can say user info equals userinfo.find.where.eq, and then we look at our admin field, which is a Boolean field, and we check to see whether or not the value of that field is true or not. Okay, and then we'll either find one of those people or not in our database. So we'll say return user info not equal to null. Okay, so that's our admin account. Now we want to add user info. So for this one, we basically want to create a new user info object. And we assume this is not a an admin, right? And once we have one of these guys, we just say save. Okay, so that one's pretty easy. Okay, and then for this one, we want to see return true if this if the email represents a known user. Okay, so hopefully this is now getting pretty simple to follow. So userinfo.find.where.eq, and then we're going to check to see that the email field is equal to email, and then we're going to use our not equals, but eq, and then we'll do find unique. Okay, and actually we want to say that not equals null. Okay, so that's the is user. Then the get user. Okay, again, this is even easier because it's supposed to return null if we can't find it. So that just means we're going to take this guy, and that's the result. That's what we want to return, because find unique is going to return null if we couldn't find that user in there. Okay, then is valid. That's fine. That's just checking to see that things are non-null. Okay, so that looks like our user info DB class, and we've got a couple imports here we don't need. So there's user info DB. Okay. Now we want to update global.java to implement the admin interface. So let's go up to here and see what this is all about. So we can get our admin from digits admin email, digits admin password. We're going to call this define admin. And then the only problem here is that we only want to add these contacts when it's the case that we haven't already added them before. Okay? So one way to do this is to simply say and user info db dot get user, and then we've got admin email dot get contacts dot is empty. Okay? Because otherwise, every time we start up the system, we'll have a defined. If we start up the system 2 or 3 times, our administrator would have been defined already, and we're just going to keep on adding these these same contacts over and over. So this is just a check to make sure that after we've added these guys the first time, I guess the bug in this would be if the administrator had actually deleted these contacts, we're going to, and had nothing in there, we'd reinitialize them. But that, it's probably good enough for now. Okay, so now set up a new digits database. Okay, so in order to do that, we have to run our SQL Pro. Okay, and we're going to have to connect. Okay, and on this, basically what we need to do is enter our username, root, and then we'll take our crazy password string here, put it in here, and then we'll type connect. Okay, and now we're connected to our local host, and then we can say add database, and we'll call this digits. Okay, so now we've got this digits database, and so the next thing we want to do is we want to edit our dot profile. Dot profile. Okay. So our database URL was using play example MySQL. And now we're going to have it be digits instead. Oops. Go back here. Digits. Okay. All right. So we created a new database digits. We've edited our environment variable. Okay, and now if we actually refresh, we're going to compile our sources. Okay, and we see this configuration editor driver not found, MySQL. Oh, I know why. Okay, so this this is the problem with this is actually that I didn't reload our project. So what I'll do is I'll just exit. I'll enter again. So we'll load our project definition, and then we'll type run. Okay, and then we'll go connected. Okay. And we've got to our login. Okay, so now it's useful now to actually login. Okay. My only concern is I'm not seeing these tables. Oh, because I'm still connected to play example MySQL. Okay, so, oh, and the reason that is because I edited the profile, but I didn't, but I'm still running in this old terminal. So, just to show you, okay, so if I go print env grep db, okay, you can see I'm still referring to this old table, okay? Not a big, not really an important issue. So I'm not gonna fix it for this particular situation. But the downside of this is that now I've got my contacts and my user info in this other database, which creates problems over time. So actually, let's go ahead and fix that. But we can see now that we've got things working the way we want it to. So I can add a new Sarah Stout 1232 765 and 9000. And we can select work. And we say add. And then if we go back here, we can see Sarah Stout is in there. Okay. And if we go into MySQL and look at contacts, there she is. Okay. So that's good. But let's see what happens if we try to fix the database that we're supposed to be operating on. So I'm going to exit, and I'm going to say source.profile. I'm going to say source ~/.profile. And then I'm going to check to see that I've got the right. Okay, so now I'm looking at the digits database. So now I'm going to say play. And then I'm going to say run. And then I'm going to reload this. Okay. And now if I select digits, okay, now we've got we've got what we intended. We're kind of back to the beginning. And we've got the data being stored in the correct database, which is very good. All right, well let's go back here and see. Run system, debug any errors. So I did have a little error when I commit our changes. So we're going to say finish WOD. Okay. And we're going to call this, I'm going to call it 60 minutes. So this is an hour-long WOD, the longest one of the semester. Yet I think there was a lot of interesting things here, and I hope you enjoyed it.